Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Tyler Norris. Tyler, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So for those of you who don't know him, Tyler has a super interesting career in the energy sector, spanning the U.S. Department of Energy, consulting, and most recently as VP of Development at Cypress Creek Renewables. He's deeply involved in the power sector in his home state of North Carolina and regularly serves as expert witness in state utility commission proceedings. He's now doing his PhD at Duke University in power systems. And I think one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to Tyler today is that he is probably the most knowledgeable person in the world right now, at least the most knowledgeable person that I know, focusing on a really big topic in US power markets at present, which is interconnection processes. I know to our listeners outside the US, that might sound like somewhat of a niche, nerdy topic, but to anyone in the US,
so necessarily,
it's a really big deal right now. So maybe Tyler, just to kick us off, could you tell us why interconnection processes are getting so much attention in the US right now?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, it became a big issue a handful of years ago as what we call these interconnection queues exploded in size. And so these are basically long lines of proposed generation assets or storage assets that are, waiting to be studied or to receive interconnection agreements or to have their interconnection facilities constructed. And we've just seen those grow essentially in every US power market, such that now, the total amount of capacity in the queues is about twice as much as all installed generation capacity. So at about 2,600 gigawatts. And, all this happening in the face of capacity retirements, right? Especially coal, but some other assets as well. And so this is already a major issue even before this year, and so much so that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission made it one of its top priorities and had a very extensive rulemaking around it and issued a very substantial order 2023. And all of that was before we had these new load forecasts coming in, which have really, as everyone knows, over the past 9 months in particular, also exploded in substantial part due to new data centers, but also, factories and reindustrialization on top of, everything we were already expecting from electric vehicles and otherwise. So I suppose that kind of encapsulates why it's a big issue.
Yeah, I think you described it very well. It feels like a perfect storm right now of load growth, retiring older assets, and then just interconnection queues where it's very challenging to bring new stuff online. One thing you cited the size of the interconnection queues, and it's pretty staggering actually if you look across markets. One thing that's come up in a few conversations recently is, a lot of those are so-called zombie projects, or projects that people put in the queue. It's more of an option than an obligation because you don't have to pay a whole lot of money, at least historically, to get a position in the queue. How much is that driving up these queues, and is that a separate issue, or is that part of this issue of system operators struggling to process the pipeline?
Yeah, I think there are several possible ways to think about it. Sort of pejorative term, we could call them sort of speculative, or I've even some people use the term they're spamming the queue, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to think it's like it's a product and part of like asymmetric information, right? Like these project developers can't know in advance, based on the way we manage the queues, where which positions will actually be viable from an interconnection standpoint in terms of their network upgrade cost. And so necessarily, any good investor, right, they're going to diversify their portfolio. And so they're going to put multiple projects into the queue in any given jurisdiction where they, see favorable market conditions generally, in the energy and capacity markets or otherwise. And so because we have this fundamental asymmetry of information, and also, it's not just asymmetric, we can't know which positions are going to be viable now increasingly in advance because we have so many projects that are seeking interconnection simultaneously in these very, very large clusters. So I sort of think about it more as, this is a piece of market information data that's being sent to the system operator or the transmission provider, telling them, where potential viable project could be sited, because right, these positions usually are required to have land contracts in place. So from that standpoint, ostensibly they're viable to be sited. Now, oftentimes they still have some degree of siting risk, right? They may not be fully zoned. They might have to go through some other sort of state permitting process, environmental permitting, et cetera. But ostensibly, right, like you've gone through to the first barrier in terms of actually securing land. And that's a useful piece of market information. And then the question is sort of what you do with it. But
Yeah, and I think in general, I tend to think of queues as a good proxy for level of commercial interest in a given region or market, but it almost becomes like a vicious cycle. Queues take long, so people want to reserve their spot, and then the more people, do that, the longer the queues take to process because there are so many projects. I want to get into all of the details, but maybe before we do, let's take a quick step back because we have a lot of folks not from the US, I'm sure, listening in. So maybe you could just help us understand at a very high level, what do we mean by an interconnection process? What are the main steps? And what does that look like in the US and maybe compared to elsewhere?
yeah, well, so in the US, right, you generally have open access requirements to interconnection service and transmission service. And so, this goes back to the 1990s with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission sort of pushing for open access. So there are these sort of pro forma interconnection procedures and agreements, right, that each transmission provider has to either abide by or demonstrate that they're otherwise sort of generally compliant with. And so in the open markets here, right, all of the agents, right, that are like making a decision about whether to enter the queue, these are all independent, private entities, and they're looking at their own outlooks on energy and capacity prices and deciding whether it makes sense to pursue such a position. And even in the non-organized markets, you have this to an important degree. They also have to provide open access to interconnection and transmission service. Although you do have more utility-owned generation and more dependence on power purchase agreements. And the other key, and obviously we can get into the geographic diversity in the U.S. It becomes difficult to characterize the U.S. as a whole because there is so much differentiation. But in most of the U.S., what's a very important factor is this whole resource adequacy construct and sort of capacity accreditation and markets, which we can kind of get into. But you sort of contrast that, with kind of like the polar opposite, of course, would be China, right, where they're making a national centralized decision on capacity expansion on a province by province level, and then they're sort of giving authorization to those provinces to add that amount of capacity, and it's not right. There are no independent sort of private agent decisions being made about whether to pursue interconnection service, right, based on like market prices. And so, in that sense, they are proactively and separately planning the transmission system, but it's sort of very distinct from the decision on adding new generation capacity.
I think that's a good way to think. So even within the US, there are wide degrees of variation in the level of planning a system operator prefers for their market. So, different grids in the US manage interconnection differently. In your research, and you've written extensively about this, you refer to two archetypes. You've got the connect and manage approach and the invest and connect approach. So could you talk a little bit about what you mean by those and how that applies to different markets in the US?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, maybe to start with invest and connect, just because it is the sort of traditional approach here, and it does apply to most of the country. And so the way it works is we have created a system that we are attempting to use the interconnection process itself to identify and fund deep network upgrades in advance, right? So we're doing a study, we're identifying those overloads, we're then assigning 100% or near 100% of the costs to the interconnection customer upfront, and then requiring the completion of those upgrades before those interconnection customers can interconnect, and critically before they can become designated as a capacity resource and therefore be eligible for capacity compensation. But the key linkage here, and what really fundamentally characterized Invest and Connect, is the decision to link interconnection service to capacity eligibility, and then how we define capacity. And so again, you're using interconnection as a sort of cost discovery and cost allocation mechanism for incrementally upgrading the network over time. And so we can kind of contrast that with what we characterize as connected managed, which, that sort of term and concept initially came from the UK. In the US, it's practiced in one market, as I think most are aware at this point, in Texas. That's ERCOT, where you're based there, Oliver. And, it's really the polar opposite approach, right? They are not using the interconnection process as a cost discovery and allocation mechanism for incremental network upgrades. In fact, they're not assigning any network upgrade costs, certainly no deep network upgrade costs to the interconnection customers. They're allowed to interconnect essentially freely. They can do so much more rapidly. There is no capacity market, right? So they're not like searching for eligibility for capacity via interconnection. And then, of course, the interconnection customer, then bears more of the risk associated with basis risk or curtailment risk. Although that actually exists in every market, because there's always the possibility of congestion related curtailment, even for capacity resources. But really, the key distinction is that because there's no capacity market, there's no capacity compensation, and therefore you're not trying to use interconnection service to become eligible or as a designated capacity resource.
Right. So as an asset developer or investor, you're trading off some degree of you get speed of interconnection. You avoid some of those upfront payments, and the grid costs are socialized across the system. And you're trading that off for maybe some degree of increased basis or price risk. But even then, I think a lot of your research shows that might not even be materially that different from other markets. I'm curious how much of, ERCOT has seen an awful lot of commercial activity in the last few years. It's built a lot of capacity, significantly more than any other ISO. How much of, some of that is market fundamentals, right? The economics for solar and for batteries are great in Texas right now. But how much of it do you think is, were other systems like PJM, like California, to update their grid processes and adopt a more connect and manage approach? Do you think they'd be moving more quickly like Texas?
As long as those markets have, a resource adequacy construct where you create this missing money issue, right? Because the money is not showing up entirely in energy prices, or you don't have what we call full strength energy prices. So as long as you have that issue, it does create challenges. I think almost certainly if those markets went full blown, connect and manage energy only, you could certainly speed up the rate at which you add generators, and I think you would generally expect that to be the case. I think it is worth noting, in California, for example, the California Public Utilities Commission comes up with these resource plans, right, that are compliant with California's various goals. And if you look at their current resource plan out to 2039, actually the single largest category of generator additions is energy only solar, particular utility scale solar. And I think it's in part because they have realized, or the folks that are now doing their resource modeling have realized that it becomes very uneconomic to require all of your variable renewables to be quote unquote fully deliverable as a capacity asset. So there's kind of, I raise it in part because there is this open question, like where will California go in the next 5 to 10 years in recognition of what it's laid out for its resource future. But as it stands, I don't think I don't know anyone that expects any market in the U.S. to go full energy only.
Well, yeah. So, let's talk about this issue of capacity, remuneration, and resource adequacy. So I think we tend to think of reliability as, or at least I have historically thought of reliability as a characteristic of the asset itself. Your gas is running or it's not. It's X% likely to have an outage at a given point in time. But obviously it's also a function of the grid. So your gas plant's no use if you can't actually get the power to where it's needed. But going back to the linkage you were talking about between grid interconnection and capacity, sort of, I suppose there's a question of how high does the bar need to be, and how much do you need to study this to let an asset interconnect, and what is the trade-off between the length of that process and the stringency of those requirements, and just getting assets online needed to build load. Like how should we think about that trade-off really?
Yeah, this is where the rubber really meets the road. So I think it's we call it being deliverable, right? So it's this concept of deliverability, and so it's as you put it, right? Like it's not useful unless you can get the generation to load. But I think it's a little bit of a misleading sort of misnomer for those that don't want to spend their time digging deep into like the study criteria for this. But you're rarely talking about a situation where generator output can't be delivered to load under normal operating conditions. I mean, yes, you may be adding a generator to a portion network that needs to add a new transmission line or upgrade just to be able to like accommodate its full output under normal operating conditions. But that's generally not what we're sort of talking about in terms of deliverability. What you're really talking about is under severely stressed grid conditions where you have peak load, you have contingencies occurring, right, with one or multiple outages, either of generators or various transmission elements, whether it's a transmission line or a substation or otherwise. And then they're looking at these conditions where you're trying to export all of the output from pockets of generators to the aggregate of load across the entire balancing authority. And so these are very, very extreme conditions. And so that's a standard, right? That's a reliability standard that has been established by regulators. And there is credibility to it, right? But it ultimately becomes a question like how conservative do you want to be with the reliability standard, and how high of a barrier of entry do you want to establish for a new generator to interconnect at all or to be eligible as a capacity resource? And I think it's sort of useful to like compare and contrast how this is working in different US markets. So in PJM, you do have this deliverability requirement where a capacity resource has to be fully deliverable to the aggregate of load in combination with all of its electrically proximate capacity resources. And this becomes a very substantial driver of the overloads that then require network upgrades. A different approach is taken by MISO and SPP. So in MISO, you do have a centralized capacity market, but what you've seen, interestingly, are projects that come in actually as energy only, and then they secure firm transmission service separately to their individual off-taker. They are still eligible as capacity resources, but they're not being held to a deliverability standard that's across the full ISO. And in SPP, it's similar in a sense, although they don't even have a centralized sort of capacity market. So basically, those generators are are getting a form of capacity compensation directly with their off taker. So, there are pros and cons to both approaches, but certainly like when you're in a paradigm, which is, very fast load growth, capacity retirements, and let alone like any environmental or sustainability or carbon goals at play, maintaining a highly restrictive criterion for projects to enter the system is going to have an impact. And that's exactly what we've seen, of course, happen in PJM, where we saw an order of magnitude increase in their capacity market clearing price in the past year.
So if I'm a system operator in PJM, I might defend myself and say, well, it's right. It's only right to have a very high standard for reliability because we're not talking about averages when we're talking about the lights going out. We're talking about those sort of tail events. And so testing the system under extreme conditions makes sense. I suppose what is a bit harder to understand is why that is linked to capacity interconnection in the first place, and to what extent those two things could be disaggregated. So you could get your interconnection agreement on the understanding that you will provide some reliability benefit to the grid, and then you address separately through ELCCs or otherwise the question of, how much reliability am I adding at a given point in time. So I suppose to put that back to you as a question is, are there moves to separate those two things, or is that a direction of travel that you think would even help?
Yeah, it gets very, very interesting. So when you talk to some folks at MISO, it depends on who you talk to, but one thing they might say is that, during some of the most stressed grid conditions on the peaks, what we actually see for a number of capacity resources that their generation, quote unquote, stays home, and that, they're servicing loads that are more electrically proximate. And so what they're not necessarily seeing in all cases is a need for the capacity resources to be fully deliverable to the aggregate of load. I mean, that's a hypothetical scenario, but not one that they're often seeing. So it's all just a question of like, which scenarios are you planning for? In terms of the disaggregation, I think this is a very important and fruitful area of research right now, potential sort of redesigns of the resource adequacy construct. But it's worth noting, right? Like you alluded to it. So effective load carrying capability, ELCC accreditation, this is entirely dynamic at this point, right? So the actual capacity value that we're assigning to different generators is now changing from cycle to cycle. And right now it may be based on however often the capacity auction is taking place. But all that is, in PJM, you just saw utility scale solar with trackers, ELCC, drop from, right, like around 50% down to 14% between the last cycle and the current one, because they claim their loss of load expectation has shifted, right, from summer to winter. So all of this is dynamic anyway. But what you're doing is on the front end, in terms of the interconnection service, it's a binary, like there's no spectrum, right? It's a fully binary standard. And then thereafter it's dynamic. And so, one approach would be to just make it sort of dynamic, from the get-go. And to be clear, there are ways of doing that within the current construct. And I think this is a really important point, especially for any of your, developer clients and maybe listening, right? I mean, you can modulate your capacity request to a portion of the nameplate of your project, right? So you can say, I want, 10 megawatts of my 100 megawatt proposed generator to be network resource interconnection service and the rest to be energy only. And then you could then incrementally upgrade the portion that's capacity eligible over time as that network capacity becomes available, subject to all those deliverability standards that we talked about. So there is a way to make this, I think, more dynamic and sort of modular. There's still a lot of like kinks in the chain, I think, to make it an efficient process. And I think we have something called provisional interconnection service, but it's still in some markets not sort of well defined and certainly could be optimized. So I think it's like within reach. We just have to do some more work to get there.
Yeah, I mean, good tip for all of the developers listening. But I think it is a good point that so the bar is incredibly high, and sort of the preparation is for a scenario that we actually rarely see in sort of in actual observed extreme weather events or system stress events. And then in addition to that, you're requiring all of this work to be done up front, which is also a sort of challenging problem given that the system is changing so rapidly with new capacity additions and new load growth. So it's a really tough bar to clear, especially given the pace of load growth in different markets.
The other critical point that's often lost is that what we define as energy-only generators can in fact complement resource adequacy. What I sometimes encounter is the notion that resource adequacy is wholly distinct from or even in conflict with adding energy-only generators. But a larger number of energy-only generators on any given system will generally enhance the system's ability to serve load during extreme contingencies. And this point is often misunderstood, I think, in part due to misconceptions about what deliverability actually means. I also noted in my recent comments at FERC on this topic that energy-only generators can also create option value for firm capacity expansion. That's because an energy-only generator already under construction or in operation can upgrade to capacity status fairly quickly if network capacity becomes available. And a final point, which is one that was actually emphasized by Southern Company in its recent comments to FERC, is that energy-only resources can improve the stability of capacity resource cluster studies. And the idea is that creating a more viable route for energy-only generators and studying them separately could reduce the size and complexity of the capacity cluster studies.
We've gone into a lot of detail looking across US markets. How do you see the order, the impact of order? You mentioned FERC order 2023 at the beginning. How does this get solved, I suppose? And is it just things have to get really bad in certain markets before things change? Or are you seeing the pace of change needed to address this issue?
Yeah, well, as you know, I mean, the key step in order 2023 was transitioning from serial-based queue processing to the cluster steady-based processing, and there's definitely something to that, and I think it has the promise of providing for more efficiencies. And we went through that sort of big transition in Duke territory in the Southeast, leading up to order 2023. I have to say that I'm concerned that if you don't sort of address some of the issues we've been talking about here, then actually the risk of even larger meltdowns in the interconnection study process, that risk could become even higher, because now you're studying simultaneously tens or possibly even hundreds of gigawatts in the same cluster, most of them, right, almost in a speculative manner, right, seeking capacity eligibility. So you're studying all of them for deliverability, and the results become almost meaningless, right? Because there's no possible way like all of them are going to interconnect as fully deliverable resources. And so, this is partly what's now creating like all of these proposals to abrogate open access and create these, fast track processes to get the right kind of generators online more quickly, including, proposals to cap the interconnection queues in size, which, I'm not suggesting is, I think to the extent that like you're trying to maintain this resource adequacy construct in linkage to interconnection service, it introduces all of these complications. And I don't know that there's the right answer, that we've sort of figured out how to do it. But I think you just have to like acknowledge that as long as you're signing up for that linkage, like it's going to be extremely complicated.
It's a real challenge, and I'm genuinely fascinated to see how this plays out across markets. And of course, one of the fears is, in addition to the human cost of not getting capacity built out quickly enough, when you do start to see system stress events, policymakers tend to do crazy things in response. Sort of all sensible policymaking goes out the window, and you can do things that screw up a power market for many years to come. So yeah, certainly concerning. Maybe just changing gears a little bit, we've spoken a lot. I think the conversation is focused mainly around competitive ISOs. I do want to ask because I know you know the Southeast, extremely well. How do you see all of this playing out in regulated utility regions? And perhaps a sort of broader question, if you'd like to elaborate on, we're seeing big moves in the West right now towards um, a greater role for markets. You've got the 37 different balancing authorities in WEC choosing whether to join CAISO's extended day ahead market or SPP's Markets Plus. At what point, or do you ever see a similar moves towards regional markets in the Southeast, which have, not been moving as quickly, I think it's fair to say, to date?
Maybe to take that in two steps. So just kind of one of the distinctions, between the organized markets and the non-organized markets, I suppose, when it comes to interconnection. One thing I think is just, helpful to be aware of is that you do then have more materiality from state level interconnection standards. And so that's something to be aware of. That does provide the possibility of more flexibility for certain states and utilities that want to get creative. So I think it's worth noting, that Southern Company, they did just come out in front of FERC and say that they are very interested in energy only interconnection service, and that they actually want to create incentives for it. And we'll see sort of exactly where that goes. But it looks like, Southern Company and their various utilities in the Southeast want to get more creative with some more flexible options. And that may be in part because of the extent of load growth. They just, Georgia Power just put out a new IRP load forecast last week, and it was something like, 32 gigawatts of data centers, which is more than twice their existing peak. So, there's something there. I think Duke sort of taken to date kind of the opposite tack. So it can be used in a flexible way or not. And just interestingly, right, like in Duke, Carolina's territory, actually the state interconnection procedures actually don't even allow energy only interconnection service. That's something that the regulators have recently expressed interest in potentially exploring a change around. So we'll sort of see where that goes. As for, the move towards more open market, so there was this proposal, the Southeast Energy Exchange Market, which was going to be, sort of a very incremental step to allowing more energy interchange across balancing authorities in the Southeast. It's not a market per se. It's still based on bilateral agreements and exchanges. That's sort of now been caught up. There were a lot of disputes against that. I think the key sign, I think, would be if there is a step towards creating an energy imbalance market in the Southeast. And I think that's possible. If they sort of set aside the SEAM proposal and moved it towards an EIM, I think they'd get a lot of buy-in from a lot of stakeholders. So I think that's like the clearest step you could see anytime in the near to medium term. You did have the South Carolina Commission require this study looking at an RTO scenario or an EIM scenario, and obviously there were substantial cost savings entailed there. But I think the thing to watch is sort of what happens with SEAM and could it possibly evolve into an energy imbalance market. And also, I just think there's going to be so much pressure from all of the new customers coming and the existing customers as that puts more strain on rates and just the fundamental reality is like if you're not sharing capacity and allowing more interchange across the systems, like that is going to drive up costs over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, it continues to surprise me that in the US of all places, 40% of power is bought and sold by vertically integrated monopolies. I was also surprised coming from a European context when I first came to the US a few years ago at how high the regulated rates of return are compared to similar industries in the UK and elsewhere. So certainly one to watch. And it's really fascinating to see what's happening in the West. That's something we're spending a lot of time thinking about right now. Before we wrap up, we've just had a major election in the US. I'm asking all of the folks I'm speaking with these days for their take on what this might mean for the energy transition going forward. So You can talk about interconnection, you can talk about other things, but any high-level thoughts on the impact you expect it to have?
Yeah,
I know we're
there.
speculating at this stage, so
Yeah, no, there's a lot obviously to discuss there. You know, order 1920. You know, question mark at this point. I do think, you know, interconnection has been very bipartisan at FERC. You know, order 2023 got a unanimous vote and then was reaffirmed on a unanimous basis. So I think that is like one potential, you know, glimmer of hope there. Unfortunately, feel a little less hopeful about Order 1920, let alone the push towards, you know, interregional transmission, just based on what's been expressed there by some of the commissioners. Um, you know, beyond, I do think, you know, there is a risk, right, of this like abrogation of open access. If there's still, you know, there's a push on that front and sort of queue jumping. So I think that's like a really important issue for everyone to keep an eye on. But you know, just to flip it for a second on the generation side, one thing I've been noting is that, I mean, obviously, you know, the cost of a lot of, you know, the inverter based resources that come down so far, like there's a momentum there that we can expect to continue. Obviously, contingent on you know, different markets and the exact sort of, you know, cost comparative with gas, but there's a certain momentum there that's sort of baked in. Whereas in my view, like the technology that's most at risk is nuclear, which really it is critically dependent on the tech neutral IRA tax incentive in combination with support from the Loan Programs Office. And if either of those get modified, I think it's going to be very difficult to get any new commercial reactors off the ground. So I'd be watching, you know, the decisions of the congressional appropriators on those two quite carefully.
yeah, it's super because it feels like there is bipartisan support for nuclear to some degree, and it has been part of Republican platforms for some time in the energy sector, but at the same time, crucially dependent on certainly both of those subsidy schemes, and certainly on the loan programs office. I think there'll be a lot of pressure to cut costs. But I do agree. I think our general take is energy transition is continuing apace, and I agree a lot of that momentum is baked in. So a nice note of optimism to end on. So just before we wrap up, one of the ways we sometimes like to end episodes is with a quick fire round of under or overrated. So I'm going to give you three things, and you'll tell me under or overrated. So let's start with the vulnerability of the U.S. power system to extreme weather.
I think underrated, and I would just note briefly that you know, if you look at like loss of load expectations and actual loss of load events in the U.S., I think they're substantially more correlated with extreme weather events than the specific contingency events that we're searching for in the interconnection study process. So yeah, I'd say underrated.
And I know you've had a lot of first-hand experience of this in North Carolina lately with the flood. So yeah. The second is the potential. We've maybe answered this, but potential for a nuclear renaissance in the U.S.
If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said underrated. I think now appropriately rated, but contingent on maintaining the key federal incentives that we just discussed.
Mm-hmm. And a final one related to what we've just discussed, I would say the prospect for a regional energy imbalance market in the Southeast by 2030.
Great question, Oliver. I don't know that anyone has rated that one yet. So I'd put unrated and very contingent on what direction, you know, the investor-owned utilities here want to go.
Great. Let's get the Polymarket poll going. Great. Well, thanks so much, Tyler. I think that's a great place to wrap up. And, you know, I think interconnection processes are one of those topics that are so central to everything that's happening in the US power market right now, but don't get often nearly enough time and attention as we've spent talking about it today. So really good luck with your research, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Tyler Norris, JB Duke Fellow at Duke University, talking to Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.